All right, welcome back. I'm excited to introduce our next speaker, Kelsey Conafee. She is the Senior Technical Product Manager at Amazon. Please join me in welcoming Kelsey to our virtual stage.
Hi, everyone. How are you? So I'm here to talk to you today about how we rapidly adapted to the changing supply chain environment at Amazon during COVID-19, i.e. the chaos that happened over the past year. So a little bit about myself. I am a senior technical product manager at Amazon on the core AI team. I was previously on the demand forecasting team, which is what we're going to spend most of today's time talking about. But prior to Amazon, I built and led cross-functional technical teams and acted as a product lead at various different startups, including Rent the Runway, Birchbox, Arda, ran my own startup, so I'm very well versed in the startup space. Most of my background, I've worked in consumer subscription, e-commerce, supply chain, have worked on a lot of internal systems automation, but pretty consistently throughout, I've worked at leveraging different applications of AI, from building recommender systems to personalization systems, price predictions, demand forecasting, obviously, neural nets and NLP. So I have kind of seen a broad range of different applications of AI, which is always fun and exciting. So to talk a little bit more about demand forecasting at Amazon. So the demand forecasting team is actually on the SCOT, or Supply Chain Optimization Technology team, which manages all of the systems that drive the automated supply chain decision making at Amazon. Demand forecasting specifically, we have 200 plus engineers, scientists, product managers, business analysts, other functions as well. We support thousands of customers across retail, FBA, as well as our external partners. And our customers can be actual human beings, but we're also supporting systems in system decision making. So our team develops and manages and scales multiple DL and ML models that support and provide forecasts for the billions of products that we sell worldwide. And they're, as I mentioned, they're really leveraged to derive that automated supply chain decision making. But we also, our team acts as essentially forecast experts to inform strategic business decisions for strategic long horizon investments or other planning decisions. So a little bit about, for any of you that have never really dabbled in forecasting or know nothing about demand forecasting, really quick crash course is that number one key tenet is historical demand is key. Most models, not all, but most models do really rely heavily on historical demand. And when we have really consistent historical demand patterns, that makes it much easier for our forecasting models to predict those patterns into the future. But obviously, when you have unexpected demand patterns, that leads to very bad forecasts. When you see things that you've never seen before, your model doesn't know how to react to that, and it will ultimately produce really, really bad forecasts. So what happens when we see things that happened during COVID, where surging demand meets a crippling supply chain shock? Well, I can tell you from experience, forecasting gets really fun and really interesting. So just talking about at a very high level, some of the supply chain challenges that Amazon faced, which I'm sure are not very different to a lot of the challenges other retailers faced during COVID, as well as other industries like the building and home supply industries. We saw that demand for certain products unexpectedly surged across the globe. So I'm sure, as a lot of you remember, toilet paper was flying off the shelves. Our supply chain literally could not produce enough toilet paper to keep up with demand. Hand sanitizer, masks, kind of those COVID related products, but also things that were a little unexpected. So baking supplies related to that sourdough craze, puzzles, workout clothing, as people got used to kind of staying and working at home. And we saw that, beyond these unexpected demand spikes, supply was extremely limited due to the fact that, the entire supply chain, most industries had really gotten into a rhythm and were used to planning cycles that were based on historical patterns. And so they were not quite ready for the ramp up in demand and the change in demand patterns that came to be during COVID. Additionally, we also saw that overall supply chain capacity and production itself became severely constrained due to lockdowns and due to outbreaks, which meant that producers and suppliers were just not able to actually create as many products to keep up with demand. And then obviously predicting the future and planning became extremely difficult due to the uncertainty and the volatility that we had really never seen before. So our goals, my team specifically, was to essentially create methodologies that will allow Amazon to flexibly adapt to supply chain shocks, to produce forecasts and advice and guidance that could support internal decision making at the highest levels. We also wanted to produce forecasts that could drive stock up buys and vendor allocation negotiations of critical products like those hand sanitizers, face masks, toilet paper, and ultimately also not just support our internal team, but provide better visibility to our external partners and producers to help them better plan and adjust to these challenges that they were facing. So, we worked with key strategic producers to really help them inform their own production planning as well. So, what did we actually do? Well, I think the one really exciting thing about Amazon is that a few people can really make a big impact. And so we put together an extremely small team. It was myself, one scientist, and one BIE, which is a business intelligence engineer. We all were already working on other projects, so we really only had a fraction of our time to dedicate to this. But we were able to quickly come together and form a SWAT team, so to speak, to move really quickly. Um, and we started with our partners and our customers. So we really dug in to try and understand their evolving needs. We met with them multiple times per week, sometimes multiple times per day, to really understand what were the problems that they were facing, and define which problems were the top priority that we wanted to focus on first. And then as we went through solution development and exploration, we wanted to work very closely with them to understand if our proposed solutions would actually address their needs. And so, the first thing that we started to do was try and make sense of what was going on. So we looked sideways and around corners at everything that we could. We started with internal data that could provide us with any sort of insight. So we were looking for historical events that we had access to in our databases that could provide some insights. We looked at, what happened during the 2008 recession. What types of products increased in demand, decreased in demand that we could potentially leverage to predict what might happen with COVID. We looked at past unexpected events. So, like what happened when we saw hurricanes in the Southeast, or wildfires in the West, or snowstorms in the Rockies or the Northeast? What did demand look like during those unexpected events? And then specifically for COVID, we also looked at what happened at a country level since the start of COVID to determine if we could identify any leading indicators of what may come to pass in future countries. So obviously, Italy and Spain were impacted the most heavily kind of first, before the rest of Europe and before the United States. And so we looked at that country level data to see if we could find those leading indicators and predict what may happen in some of these other marketplaces that we supported. And we also looked at things like tax refunds. So COVID kind of started right when tax refunds were hitting people's bank accounts. So how have previous tax refund events impacted demand behavior? And we also looked at external data. So we were looking and monitoring COVID case rates, COVID replication rates. We leveraged and integrated those external data sets into our own modeling. We looked at and started tracking government lockdown data. We also leveraged mobility data by other companies like Google and Apple. We also looked at economic impact projections by economists that were trying to predict, are we going to have a K-shaped recovery? Are we going to have a huge recession? Are we going to have a quick bounce back? What are those different projections that economists are predicting? And we also looked at, what was the timing of like when stimulus checks were going to hit people's bank accounts, how much were those stimulus checks going to be for, and how do we expect those to actually impact demand? And it's important to note that although we had a very small SWAT team, it was definitely not just us focusing on this. This was very much a group effort. We worked across all teams and functions. We reached out to many different people to try and figure out other teams that were thinking about very similar problems or related problems. How could we leverage their expertise and some of their approaches across Amazon? So, this is just a list of some of the teams that we worked with that were awesome partners and extremely helpful in actually driving a solution. And really, identify specifically like what areas had methodologies been developed or researched that we could adapt to provide to develop our own solutions. So some of the things which we'll talk about a little bit in more detail included, correcting for availability. So for example, our forecasts by default predict for unconstrained demand, which means we don't care about the stock status, is something in stock or not. We don't care about the profitability. We just care about what is the unconstrained customer demand for this product. But obviously, with COVID, we saw massive spikes in out of stock. So when we no longer have in stock demand signals to rely on for our models, how do we correct for that? Like, how do we still leverage search or other mechanisms to determine what true demand is for a product, even though we might not actually be in stock of that product? Demand spike detection, how do we identify that a demand spike is actually happening and differentiate a demand spike from a typical seasonal pattern? Again, in March and April, we have a lot of people buying typically like spring seasonal, lawn and garden. Things are starting to move towards, it was kind of around Easter as well. So there are lots of seasonal products that we didn't necessarily want to have to act on. And how do you develop a methodology to develop a distinction between those seasonal versus ASINs that are unexpectedly spiking, and many other things. And we really focused on rapid iterations. So we knew that kind of developing a solution, going into a corner and like working on that for a month and then coming back to customers and presenting it was not going to be a viable option to get to a good solution. And so we really focused on reducing feedback loops and accelerating learning cycles to accelerate our development and our learning. So like I mentioned, we had multiple syncs per week, sometimes per day, with our customers to really understand how is the environment evolving, how are their needs evolving, and to test and iterate on our proposed solutions. So we created and launched our first methodology and interventions in less than 2 weeks. And we really leveraged existing tools and systems that would allow us to reduce that time to launch. But obviously, we continued to iterate and evolve over the coming months as the environment really shifted as well. And then, once we felt that we had a methodology and a solution that really worked well and had been tried and tested across multiple different applications, we focused on scaling so that we could reduce manual effort and expand to support additional customers. So we developed things like SOPs and onboarding processes that would allow customers to kind of self-onboard. We added flexibility and configurations into our solution to allow for additional and new use cases. So for example, we started working on this in March and, when the focus was COVID, but later in the year, we started getting questions around scenarios like back to school, and, kind of ease back or the end of lockdowns, like back to normal. So we started adapting to support those additional use cases beyond just a new COVID wave. We automated our workflows to really reduce manual effort, and we integrated with existing tracking mechanisms to make sure that we were able to constantly monitor our impact and make sure that we were not negatively producing unexpected results. So, what did we actually do? We developed a new forecast methodology, and based on our conversations with customers, the key needs, and our partners, we identified that the key was to be able to provide visibility at an aggregate product group level, meaning how much toilet paper demand do we have? How much hand sanitizer demand do we have? As opposed to how much two-ply Cottonelle four-pack, demand do we have? And adjust for different demand scenarios. Like I was mentioning, what happens when we have a second, a third, and a fourth COVID wave? What happens when some states start going back to school while others don't? What happens if there's a new lockdown? Um, and ultimately, really focused on developing a post processing mechanism that could be easily applied on top of our existing baseline system forecasts. Initially, they were generated on demand, so we could generate them multiple times a day or per week. And they were ultimately applied as interventions on our system forecasts. So, to go into a little bit more detail about what was our actual methodology, what does it actually look like? So, this is just a high level. I'll go into each of these in a second. But it started with essentially demand spike identification. So, like I was mentioning, how do we even know that this is something that we should be looking at or we should be acting on versus something that is seasonal that our forecasts already know how to handle? How do we adjust all of our demand forecasts prior to COVID? We're at what we call an ASIN level, and an ASIN is just a single specific product. So, like I mentioned, that two-ply four-pack of Cottonelle toilet paper. So we needed to figure out a methodology to actually aggregate to general all toilet paper. We needed to correct for availability because we were seeing large out of stock on all of these critical products. We needed to adjust for recent demand trends and then apply our various different demand scenarios and provide guidance to our customers and systems as to which of those scenarios to actually select. And then ultimately, the last step was to disaggregate back down to an ASIN level so that our new forecasts could be integrated into our downstream systems, all of which operate at the ASIN level. So that was our last step to make sure that our solution could be easily integrated to all existing systems without a need to re-engineer across the hundreds of teams that are across Scott and manage our supply chain. So going a little bit more into detail, demand spike identification, as I mentioned before, is actually pretty tricky. Demand at an ASIN level can be very volatile sometimes. Consumables products tend to be a little bit more consistent, but when you're talking about things like fashion or lawn and garden or toys or appliances, demand patterns can be more sporadic. And so, we developed a methodology to determine what truly was a demand spike and not just a temporary blip or a seasonal pattern that we already knew how to handle at the ASIN level. And then we took that to drive a aggregation methodology where we essentially leveraged a couple of new signals such as search and search data essentially to identify how to develop a cluster of ASINs. So you'd be pretty surprised. This is a long-standing problem that Amazon has tried to solve many times before across search, browse, forecasting, you name it. But there still isn't really like one consistent, or at the time, there wasn't necessarily one consistent way to define a cluster of products and say, these products definitively are all toilet paper, or these products are all definitively face masks. And so we had to develop a methodology to identify that clustering mechanism. And then availability correction. So as I mentioned, availability correction gets really critical when you have high out of stock, which we were seeing really for the first time during COVID, where most of the demand signals that our models relied on, which required a product to actually be in stock, had gone away and disappeared. And so how do you determine when something is completely out of stock, you're not showing it to customers, customers are not browsing it, they're not searching it, they're not clicking on it? How do you determine what demand for that product is, or unconstrained demand for that product is, when you really lose those signals. The next was essentially to adapt to recent demand trends. So we looked at a lot of different mechanisms to adapt, including like forecast calibration, recent week demand trend analysis, and a couple others to really determine what was the best mechanism to adjust our future move forward looking forecasts to correctly map for the new demand spike trajectory. So we did a lot of research into, like for different products or different types of products, how long did these demand spikes last? When did they peak and when did they start going down? How do you determine if something has reached that peak and is shifting now and it's starting to go down? So there was a lot of research and development to determine exactly how we should be adjusting our forecasts to those rapidly adapting demand patterns. And then the last was scenario application and selection. So as I mentioned, we worked with different customers, at the very beginning. A lot of the questions that we got were, when is there going to be a second spike? And is that second spike going to be as large as the first one? Is it going to last as long? Is it going to be shorter? How many months between the spikes? So we had to essentially develop a mechanism to say, let's take all of these potential scenarios that we may want to plan for. And let's actually produce a scientific methodology that's backed on data as opposed to just a rough guess, saying, let's just assume it's going to be a 20% demand spike and we're just going to apply that buffer and that's going to be the scenario we plan for. So how do we make that a little bit more scientific was what we focused on for that stage. And then ultimately, how do we provide guidance to our customers, both humans and downstream systems, as to which of these scenarios are super aggressive and extremely risky versus a little bit more conservative? And how do they fit in with the strategies these business teams and systems are trying to make? So how do we provide that guidance to give as many scenarios as possible to our customers, but allow them to make informed decisions about which scenario they decide to use for planning moving forward. And then, as I mentioned, the last step is disaggregating everything. So we had these group level forecasts, disaggregating them back down to the product level so that our downstream systems could easily ingest these new forecasts without the need to really, change any of our systems or invest in heavy engineering to get something out to production. So what was our impact? It was, as I mentioned at Amazon, particularly on the Scott team, you really have a huge opportunity to make a large impact. So with our small team and our solution that we launched pretty quickly, over the course of just the first 6 months of COVID, starting in March, we drove over $500 million in buying decisions, which was really scary, but also really exciting to see. We also saw that, one of our key targets and our goals was to increase Amazon's allocation of these key critical products. And we saw that because of our work with our partners, because of these new forecasts and these better planning tools, we were able to increase Amazon's allocation of these products after the initial COVID wave by 40%, which is pretty significant. And just in terms of strategic long-term investments. So we weren't just trying to predict the next 4 months or 5 months or 12 months even. We were actually developing forecasts over the next 4 years. And we found that for those super long-term horizon investments, our methodology was used to inform over $50 million worth of strategic decisions, which is really exciting. But also beyond just the numbers, I think to me, the most exciting thing was that we really increased our ability to allow Amazon and our customers and our partners to really understand and adapt to unexpected events, which was something that we really didn't have the capability to do before. So again, we were able to, with our methodologies, we were able to now identify demand spikes, view and react to different demand trends in aggregate, and determine when an intervention may or may not be merited, and support strategic planning. And so, where do we go from here? I think the really exciting thing to me is that, this was not just a product that we built to kind of like handle COVID and it was used in that crazy time and we're never going to touch it again. This is really something that's going to live on and drive strategic decision making at Amazon and within our supply chain moving forward. So we are going to continue to build more flexibility into our supply chain systems just as a whole. That's one thing that we're really investing in very heavily. But in terms of the actual applications of our solution that we developed, we're continuing to use them, today, and we'll continue to use them for determining when an intervention should be placed and how much of an intervention should be placed. We're supporting additional supply chain shocks. So is leveraged during, in January during Brexit. We're using it for some of the snowstorms that just came through Colorado and Wyoming. I can guarantee you we're going to be using it during hurricane season. So we now have this methodology that can just be spun up and leveraged for all of these different applications. But also beyond those kind of unexpected events, it's really changed how we think about capacity management. And so we're actually evolving our initial solution to support more advanced capacity management optimizations, as well as selection assortment optimization. So really providing more strategic and data-driven insights into those processes, which is super exciting for us. So yeah, that's it from me. If anyone has any questions or wants to reach out to me, I'm super friendly, very accessible. Feel free to shoot me a note and I'd be happy to chat. Looking forward to answering all of your questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kelsey. Thank you for sharing these incredible insights with us. This has been an awesome story and we really appreciate you sharing. I know the audience is giving you a huge virtual round of applause.
Hey,
all right, for the audience, it's time for you to make your way to your next session. And along the way, make sure you accept your connection request and check out our awesome AI exhibits. Thanks so much, and we'll see you around.